Hey everyone, and welcome back to the channel. Today, we're diving into a story that almost everyone thinks they know, how America was discovered. You're probably picturing Christopher Columbus, right? Sailing the ocean blue in 1492, landing in the New World, and boom, history is made. Well, like most things in history, the real story is way more complicated and honestly a lot more interesting. First off, let's get a big misconception out of the way. Columbus didn't discover America. I mean, how can you discover a place where millions of people are already living? For thousands of years, vibrant, complex societies had been thriving across the Americas, from the massive city-states of the Aztec and Inca empires to the countless diverse cultures spread across North and South America. This land was anything but empty. The real story isn't one of discovery, but of encounter, a collision of worlds that would change the planet forever. And even if we're just talking about Europeans, Columbus wasn't the first to arrive. Let's rewind the clock about 500 years before Columbus even set sail. We're talking about the Vikings. These legendary Norse seafarers were the ultimate explorers of their time, led by the famously named Elias Ericsson, son of Eric the Red. A group of Vikings sailed west from Greenland around the year 1000. They were looking for new lands, resources, and trade opportunities, and they found them. They landed on the shores of what is now Canada, likely in Newfoundland. They called this new land Vinland, which means wine land, supposedly because they found wild grapes growing there. They even established a small settlement. Archaeologists have actually found the remains of this Norse village at a site called Lanzox Meadows. So, a full 5 centuries before Columbus, Europeans had already set foot in North America. The Viking settlement didn't last long, though. It was small, far from home. And their relationship with the local indigenous people, whom they called Skrellings, was often hostile. Within a few years, they packed up and went back to Greenland, and the memory of Vinland faded into myth and saga. For hundreds of years, the story of this early encounter was largely forgotten by the rest of Europe. So, if the Vikings came first, why is Columbus the one who gets all the credit? Well, it all comes down to timing and impact. Fast forward to the late 15th century, Europe was in the middle of the Renaissance, a period of booming trade, new ideas, and intense competition between kingdoms. The big prize was trade with the East China, India, and the Spice Islands. Spices like pepper, cinnamon, and cloves were worth more than gold, but getting them was incredibly difficult. The overland Silk Road was long and dangerous, and the sea routes were controlled by rival powers. This is where Christopher Columbus, an ambitious and persistent Italian navigator from Genoa, enters the picture. He had a radical idea. At the time, everyone who was educated knew the world was round. That's a common myth, that people thought the earth was flat. The real debate was about how big the planet was. Columbus made a major miscalculation. He believed the earth was much smaller than it actually was, and he thought Asia was much wider. Based on his faulty math, he proposed that you could reach the rich markets of the East Indies by sailing west across the Atlantic, and that it would be a relatively short journey. He pitched his idea to the King of Portugal, who was a maritime powerhouse, but their experts saw the flaws in his calculations and turned him down, undeterred. Columbus spent years trying to find a sponsor for his risky voyage. He was rejected by courts all over Europe. Finally, he got his break in Spain. King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella had just finished the Reconquista, uniting Spain under Christian rule, and they were eager to expand their influence and find a new route to the riches of the East that would bypass their Portuguese rivals. They decided to take a gamble on this persistent Italian sailor, so in August 1492, Columbus set sail from Spain with 3 small ships, the Nia, the Pinta, and his flagship, the Santa. The journey was much longer and more difficult than he had promised his crew. After more than a month at sea, with supplies running low, the crew was on the verge of mutiny. They were in completely uncharted waters, farther from land than any European had ever intentionally sailed before. Columbus had to use every bit of his leadership and some creative record-keeping in his logbook to keep the expedition going. Then, on October 12, 1492, a lookout spotted land. It wasn't Japan or China, as Columbus believed, but an island in the Bahamas. He named it San Salvador. He had arrived in a world that was completely new to Europeans. He encountered the local people whom he called Indians because he was convinced he had reached the East Indies. For the rest of his life, across 4 separate voyages, Columbus would explore the Caribbean, parts of Central and South America, and he would go to his grave believing he had found a new route to Asia. He never realized he had stumbled upon two entire continents that were previously unknown to his world. This is the key difference between Columbus's voyage and Leif Erikson's. While the Vikings' arrival was a historical footnote, Columbus's arrival set off a permanent and irreversible chain of events. His voyages triggered a massive wave of European exploration, conquest, and colonization that completely reshaped the world. It kicked off what we call the Columbian Exchange, the widespread transfer of plants, animals, culture, human populations, technology, diseases, and ideas between the Americas, West Africa, and the Old World. Think about it. Before 1492, there were no horses, cattle, or pigs in the Americas, and in Europe, there were no potatoes, tomatoes, or corn. It's hard to imagine Italian food without tomatoes or Irish history without the potato, but that was the reality. This exchange transformed diets and economies on both sides of the Atlantic, but the exchange was not equal. The most devastating part was the transfer of diseases. Europeans brought with them smallpox, measles, and influenza. The indigenous peoples of the Americas had no immunity to these new diseases, and the result was catastrophic. Epidemics swept through communities, wiping out an estimated 90% of the population in some areas. This demographic collapse is one of the greatest tragedies in human history, and it made it much easier for European powers to conquer and control the land. So, when we talk about Columbus, we're not just talking about one man or one voyage. We're talking about the beginning of a new era, an era of global connection, but also an era of colonization, exploitation, and immense suffering for the original inhabitants of the Americas. His journey wasn't one of pure heroic discovery. It was a complex and often brutal encounter that had profound consequences that we are still dealing with today. So, who discovered America? The first people to discover it were the ancestors of Native Americans who crossed the Bering Strait land bridge tens of thousands of years ago. The first Europeans were the Vikings, who came and left without making a lasting impact, and Christopher Columbus was the one whose arrival, by a combination of accident, ambition, and timing, connected two hemispheres of the globe and set in motion the creation of the modern world as we know it. It is a story that challenges us to look beyond the simple textbook version and understand the different perspectives and the deep, lasting impact of this historical moment. It's not just about a date in 1492. It's about the collision of worlds and the creation of our own. Thanks for watching, everyone. If you found this interesting, hit that like button and subscribe for more deep dives into history. See you next time.